So, start recording. Okay. And what I need to do is find the share screen and let's see. Okay, can you see that? It says Zen and the Joy of Podcasts.
The Joy of Podcasts, yeah.
Well, I'll just run through everything that I ran through, and I'll make comments which pretty much represent what I recall hearing what some of the other guys are saying. And at any time, just dive in with questions, because it looks like you've already been diving into podcasts and have probably more of a knowledge of it than probably a lot of the other guys.
I'm an intermittent user of podcasts. I do a lot in the car and less at home, but I do watch the podcasts that I like, and I pick episodes and listen to them. I don't listen to everything.
And I guess in one way my inspiration for suggesting this is that I've often talked up podcasts in meeting with various people, but I find out that there's what I would call podcast hesitancy among a lot of people. And so what I've tried to do with this presentation is, here is my path forward. Here's the way that I deal with it. I probably would be considered an avid podcast listener, but I'm trying to design this presentation in such a way that you too can become a podcast listener or more of a listener. And one of the things that works for me is that I don't watch CNN or any live TV news. I've also pretty much turned away even from live radio. And like you, when I'm driving around in the car, I turn on a podcast, and I always pick one. And I guess what I look for, and what you would see in this presentation, is that there's quite a breadth to podcasts. But what I look for is the opportunity to take a deep dive, just like I was talking about that in your Time BBC broadcast on longitude, which I'll have to go back and listen to again now that I fell asleep listening to it. So so let's see if I can get this working in the right way. Okay. What is that? Hold on. This thing did a jump on me. Well, I mentioned the hesitancy. I did some checking in preparation for this. In the US, there's like 2 million podcasts, 48 million episodes, reaching into 50% of all homes. Like 37% listened in the last month, 24% in the last week. And I'm among the 16 million avid podcast fans. And most of that growth actually over the last 10 or 15 years. And it's really only kind of really got going about 15 years ago. But it's mainly people putting the podcasts onto their mobiles, onto their smartphones, and making them mobile. The other interesting thing that I dug up looking at various stats was that the number one, the top three categories were comedy, education, and news. And I'm saying, gee, I'm not listening to any comedy. Education, I guess, somewhat. and news. Certainly, there's a certain element of that. But I would say, as I said, my interest is in uh, delving into interesting people and interesting topics that I can kind of get my head around.
Well,
Um,
it's exactly the same as me. I've never listened to a comedy podcast, and I don't tend to listen to news podcasts. Will listen to analysis, but news
right.
is just it's fresh bread. It goes stale in a day, so I don't
Oh,
really
well,
want to do that.
it goes staler an awful lot quicker. Um, the other thing that I try to address is that, well, just like I said, there's like 2 million podcasts. Every time I turn around, I'm hearing about uh, more podcasts. Just about anybody who's anybody has a podcast. Somebody questioned one of the guys, one of the UCD guys says, well, Bernard, do you have your podcast? I says, no,
Nope.
no, no plans, no intent. And the other thing I'll get into has to do with delivery platforms and the equipment mainly designed to make you mobile. So here we go. Here's uh, a shot of my screen. I use um, Pocket Casts, and this is probably a quarter of all the screens that I have. And to some extent, people will say, "Good Lord, how do you deal with all of that?" And there actually is an easy way of dealing with it, which I will get into. Well, actually, if you look down at the bottom of the screen where I'm putting, there's something called filters, and one of the main filters that you have is the newest one. So I just look at what has popped up in the last 24 hours, and that's what pretty much drives what I look at. And then I'm frequently just sending those that I'm really not interested in, or that particular episode, I'll just send that into the archive. Um, I was talking about interesting people. Actually, this morning I did listen to a podcast, which was an interview by Bill Clinton of Jose Andres, and he's the guy who founded World Central
Kitchens,
Kitchen.
yeah.
Um, and very, very interesting, humane guy. Uh, Another one, Mark Cuban, who's probably best known for, I think he owns the Mavericks NBA team in Dallas. But I've heard him interviewed a number of times, and he's just uh, chock full of good sense. And a guy called Scott Galloway that I have gotten to know within the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 months, and he's a prophet at NYU, but also an entrepreneur in his own right, and another guy who's chock full of good common sense, and in particular advice to young people, and that's I'm struggling with a 33-year-old that needs a good kick in the arse, and but having it delivered from his dad does not work.
So you're using Mark Galloway to do it.
Mm, the I'm also got into this a lot from listening to authors, Doris Kearns Goodwin,
Yeah, I
particularly.
know all of these. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and the so all of these gives you a deep dive, like particularly Ronan Farrow into the Me Too movement, uh, and actually Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, his last book I think was uh, a letter to my son, and I'd love to find a way to get a letter to my son. In fact, I'll give you some background on that in a minute. Music. I'm a huge follower of Rhiannon Giddens.
Well, I noticed that on Facebook.
Yes, The She actually is a frequent visitor to Lafayette, and there are a number of Cajun musicians here that have their own recording studios. And she was here about, I'd say, maybe 18 months ago, and spent maybe 2 years ago, and spent several weeks down here with a group of other Black uh, banjo players, and made a recording out of which became a tour sponsored by the Smithsonian of Black female banjo players. So, and she's somebody who has whose background and uh, what she studied at was opera at Oberlin. So the uh, I just can't get enough of her, and actually married to an Irish guy who's she's no longer with, but she's taken up with an Italian lover who's uh, quite a wonderful guy as well. But the other side of looking at music is looking at like the music producers and the people who are behind pulling this all together. And I'll have some examples of that uh, later on. Um, the Bruce Springsteen has actually started a podcast. He
Oh,
and Obama, you may be familiar with that.
yeah, I read about that.
Yeah, I've listened to some of them, and they're about half an hour. So it's, as I say, the number of people who are getting into podcasts, and some of these have podcasts, like Conan O'Brien has one, or there are people who are interviewed. So they're both on kind of both sides of the screen, so to speak. Um, the uh, when I look at news and politics, I guess since the election and since uh, the tumult of January the 6th, I've turned away an awful lot from an intense uh, focus on current politics, with the exception of one area which is a hot button for me, which has to do with voting. And Mark Elias is a guy who's probably got more knowledge and insight, and he was the litigant on behalf of the Democrats for the 60 or so cases that they brought after the whether defending or whatever after the 2020 election. Carville, one of the architects of Bill Clinton's campaign. So,
And Nina Totenberg, the legal commentator.
pardon?
Nina Totenberg, the legal commentator.
Yes, very much on the Supreme Court. Yes.
Yeah. I'm familiar with all of these guys. Yeah.
Good.
But I too I have no interest in just the politics anymore. I'm taking a rest.
Yes. Well,
in general, I don't really, not watching much CNN, not listening to many political podcasts. Basically, taking a break. It was too intense.
well, I would say I'm on a similar track. I'm more interested in a deep dive into the why, and an understanding of what's why did 70 million people vote for uh, uh, the orange fella that
The great
lives
Satan.
100 something miles south of you. The Well, this will give you an idea of some of the areas that pop up on my selection list, and I will get into in greater depth with the ones that are what I call quirky and fun, and what I consider is one of the great bonuses is, and it looks like you already are. If you're going on long journeys, a couple of hours in anywhere, but particularly in the car, um, we always spend a lot of time selecting particular long episodes that we can listen to. Um, there was a time that I would always, in news and politics, would listen into the daily on the New York Times. Um, but
No, not anymore.
now it's maybe one or two a week, maybe not at all. The My reason for instance, listening frequently to David Axelrod, uh, in his uh, uh, he's now with the Institute of Politics in Chicago and also on CNN. But when he interviews somebody, it's generally an hour long, and um, and and he first spends the first 15 or 20 minutes getting into a lot of detail on their background and who their parents were and where they grew up and what were the influences on them at an early part of their life. So I like those deep dives into somebody's particular life.
I
Um,
listened to the Axe Files, but I wasn't aware of Hacks on Tap.
well, Hacks on Tap. I'm listening to that less and less, and that's more a dive um, uh, into current events. And like you were saying, and I was also agreeing with, I'm listening to that less and less. And actually, thinking about this slide, I probably should put in the Axe Files because that's the one that does the deep dive, like you mentioned.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, the you know People who I listen to Kara Swisher a lot. She's connected with Vox, VOX, but
Yeah, I don't know
also
Kara Swisher.
pardon.
I don't know her.
Oh, well, that's somebody that I would. Uh, she's somebody who's been deep diving into the tech world for the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. She has her own podcast twice a week. I mean, she'll get, Tim Cook or, the top guy at Microsoft. She had the guy who ran Parler and had tore him to bits on his. So a very, very effective and quite a charming lady. She also does a podcast with Scott Galloway called The Pivot, and and that's I find it very, very entertaining. I would just suggest listening to it a couple of times and seeing if it appeals to you.
Mhm.
The Preet Bharara
I listened to him. He's on
and
my list.
well, my wife in particular is a devotee of Preet. I was listening to it yesterday in the car along with Rabia, and I was just saying, oh, they're getting into all the detail on um, the ins and outs of uh, you know the the George Floyd case and all of that. And I said, geez, I think that's become like too much in the weeds for me. But if you want to know what's really going on with the case against the Giuliani, Preet Bharara, like Giuliani, was in exactly that position with the Southern District of New York.
Yeah.
So he's um, and Ezra Klein, and I think what's happened with Ezra Klein, he was one of the founders of Vox, and just within the last, I don't know, 6 months, got hired by the New York Times.
Yeah, he's
And,
an op-ed columnist.
pardon?
He's an op-ed columnist or
Yes.
opinion writer now they call them.
But the interesting thing to me was they hired him not just for being a columnist, but also that he brought with him his own podcast, and he kept that. And I think just in terms of advice that you can give your grandkids, there's a a huge new business that has grown up around podcasts. The number of people that are employed just for the daily, I think is 20, 30, or 40 people. And that was nothing. Um, uh, so it's the the podcast piece of a media company like the New York Times and the Washington Post and Vox and a whole bunch of them. It's become a revenue stream. Now, somebody asked a question. I think Barry O'Dwyer asked a question. Where are they making their money? And as you know, most of these things um, uh, are driven by advertising, and you'll get 2-3 minutes in a half an hour of advertising. My way around it is that there's a button on the Pocket Cast
The
that
15.
will advance at 45 seconds. So I did that a couple of times and zoomed through. But the other interesting thing is in Europe, it's not so much ad driven as subscription, and uh, and most of that is because, well, in the US it's all one language, English. In Europe it's multiple languages, 20 or 27 of them or whatever. Um, the But here's an interesting thing: Spain is the per capita #1 in Europe, uh, followed by Ireland, followed by Switzerland, France, and the Nordic countries. And Spain actually has a higher percentage penetration of regular podcast listeners. So, and I think you're going to see more and more of the subscription model coming in. The Preet Bharara actually had his own called Cafe, and has now been sold to Vox Media, and he's got a regular podcast, and then he has a subscription service called Cafe. So I think you're going to see more and more. In fact, I responded to a survey with the New York Times several months ago, and it was very clear from all the questions they were asking as to whether or not you would be susceptible to paying for a subscription service. So I think that's another means of them to generate revenue, because I suspect that the ad side is doesn't cover costs except for some of the top rated ones. The what I call the long view, again, this is another deep dive, and what the Guardian and the New York Times, with their weekend version of the Daily, are generally 45 minutes to 60 minutes of a deep dive into a particular topic. And again, I very, very much appreciate that. Lawfare is an outfit that most of the people have been involved in intelligence, military, cyber, that sort of area. And for instance, when the Mueller report and all of that was going through, they were the ones that I would go to get a deeper dive into what really is going on. And they're still at it, and very, very much a very, very useful resource. And I was mentioning that Mihal, who like me spent a lot of time in the Boston area, would know this guy, Christopher Lydon, who was a very, very well-known broadcaster. He had his daily show on the local public radio in the Boston area. And then about, I'd say more than maybe 20 years ago, set up his own. He was probably one of the first people to start a podcast. And what I like about Chris Lydon and is probably a feature of a lot of people that I follow. He's got what I would call a superb Rolodex. It doesn't matter whether it has to do with literature, with economics, with current topics. He can call in a wide variety of very credible people to chat with them for 10 minutes or for an hour, and uh, it's something that I go to on a very regular basis. And he publishes, maybe twice a month, or it's not on a regular schedule, but somebody that's to my mind very well worth listening to. I like deep dives on literature. There's a lady called Eleanor Wachtel, uh, who's had this podcast going for on Canadian radio, and I've often said, if there's a particular writer that you're interested in, you could go and Google, Eleanor Wachtel or Writers and Company and that particular author, and undoubtedly somebody would pop up. And I'm trying to remember who I listened to recently. And the New Yorker fiction, I used to subscribe to the New Yorker, but I would never kind of really get into their fiction.
I could never finish it. I could never read it before the next one came, because I subscribed to the Atlantic and Harper's and the Humanist, right, and the New Republic and all this stuff, and I just wasn't reading them. So I stopped my subscription about a year ago.
Yeah, well, I've done the same, but what I listen to once a month, they contact an author and say, well, here we have whatever it is, 70 plus years of a fiction essay from the New Yorker. You, author, go and pick one and then read it as part of our podcast. And then when you're done with that, then we'll discuss it. And it's the Deborah Treisman, who's the fiction editor for the New Yorker. And they get into a very interesting conversation on the particular essay. So it's something that's to me, very entertaining. And again, when I was a subscriber to the New Yorker, I wasn't reading the fiction, but as a subscriber of the podcast, I pretty much listen to all of the ones as they drop. And actually,
I would start the fiction in the New Yorker, and probably 1 in 5 I would finish.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
because they didn't always grab me,
Right. Yes. So this is another screen, and somebody actually asked me a question about when I say a subscriber to a podcast. Subscribe doesn't mean that I'm paying money for it. It just means that I clicked on getting the daily or weekly feed and listening to it as.
And you can delete anything you want.
Yeah. On COVID, I do listen religiously to Mike Osterholm. He's been like 45 years as a epidemiologist, a detective, if you like to say, medical detective, and also a very kind man. And I think it comes out on a Thursday. I was actually looking for it yesterday, and he's got a very global view, and he was somebody who was advising Biden in the transition, and continues to be in touch with them. He was the one who was very much promoting the idea that we should get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible, and to make that even more effective, that you should delay by 2 or 3 months the second dose, so you give them all the first dose. That didn't. Fauci didn't go for that, and the various teams at the White House. But he continues to advise behind the scenes to the White House. Interestingly enough, Canada and a couple of other places around the world have picked up on that idea and have said, yeah, I mean, it's only kind of a quirk of the way that they set up their trials, that the J&J is just one dose and the Pfizer and Moderna are a double dose. It could have easily gone the other way. And anyway, that's how I deal with my COVID stuff. Music. Check out Malcolm Gladwell. He's got a number of very, very interesting podcasts. He's got.
I didn't know that he was that he was interested in music.
Oh, well, that was my introduction to him, was through Revisionist History, which is a whole wonderful series of podcasts. But he and I think it's Rick Rubin got together on Broken Record, and they would do a deep dive into various artists. Another one there is at the end, again, Rhiannon Giddens, and from her background as an opera singer, she's now teamed up with the Met Opera in New York. And what happens on that particular podcast, they will take a well-known aria from like La Traviata or something like that, and they will play it. They will interview one of the well-known singers of that particular aria, and then they will break it down almost like sentence by sentence. Here's what's going on. Here's the background to this, and even making references to issues that are very, very prominent even today. A very entertaining half an hour, and I like opera, but I don't like spending 3.5, 4 hours immersed in a particular one. In fact, I've gone a number of times to the Wexford Opera Festival, and they specialize in picking off operas that are not very, very well known. But I don't go to any of those. What they do is they have these lunchtime mini operas, so they'll take, Turandot or the Marriage of Figaro or something like that, and they'll do an hour-and-a-half version of it as you sit at tables eating your lunch. And
all the highlights.
They're fabulous. And I said, Jesus, I wish more people would do stuff like that. Here's my Irish list. Some of them you may already be familiar with.
I don't do any Irish podcasts at the moment, but
the one that I listen to probably most frequently is Eamon Dunphy, and what I get from Eamon Dunphy is, again, he's a guy who's got an excellent Rolodex. So when it comes to Premier League soccer, which I follow, he's very pally with Johnny Giles, who used to play for Leeds and Manchester. I know Eamon Dunphy himself played for Manchester United for a while. But the other thing is he's very pally with Bertie Ahern. So if there's something happening on the Irish scene, particularly with the North and that sort of thing, he can get Bertie on the phone. He's got another guy, I think his name is Chris Johns. uh, who used to be the chief economist for the Bank of Ireland and now writes a weekly column in the Irish Times, generally on politics and economics. Uh, so he'll get somebody like, so he's got a really good Rolodex that, so I don't listen to, he's on maybe twice a week. I'll check to see who he's talking to and then move on. He was actually a very good source during the Brexit situation, and he had a number of people that he could call on that would give a good rundown. Again, a quick and deep dive as to what really is happening. The Now, some hosts that I really like. Alec Baldwin has got a very interesting collection of people that he will interview, mostly in the entertainment world, but not necessarily. Al Franken, who used to be a senator, and I was very sad to see him, shoved off the stage. And so he's got his own podcast, but also somebody interviewed him recently, so he's been on both sides. Well, you're probably very familiar with Terry Gross.
Terry Gross is my number one.
Yes.
A Fresh Air. And I lived in Philadelphia for the last 6 or 7 years of my career, and I used to see her in certain restaurants.
Oh, right.
She eats out every night, and in a small area near her apartment, and she's like a little bird. I think she comes in and has an appetizer with her husband and leaves. But people go up and talk to her. But if you're down near the Ben Franklin Bridge, there's a area of restaurants underneath it, and she lives very close to there somewhere, and she's always in one or other of them.
Right.
So I've seen her 6 or 7 times.
Oh, great. Yeah, no. And that's probably, in fact, I think it was Barry Walsh who made a comment that what got me into being an avid podcast listener was I had, for probably the best part of 10 or 12 years, a daily commute where I was an hour each way from here in Lafayette to Baton Rouge and back. And people were always saying to me, gee, now this would be a real pain. And in fact, I didn't mind it at all because it was mainly all highway for most of the time. I turn on a podcast and I generally pick one or two that would last half an hour, and I would get to my destination. And so it really worked well for me. Here we are with the fun and quirky ones. And I mentioned revisionist history from Malcolm Gladwell. We just talked about In Our Time, where I just listened to and fell asleep during the podcast on longitude. But I mean, there's the archive of In Our Time from BBC Radio 4 is just superb. Michael Lewis, he was the one who wrote Moneyball.
The money stuff. He wrote the baseball stuff, did he?
Yes, and he also wrote one on the financial collapse in 2008. Trying to think of the name of that, but he this series of podcasts that he did was mainly about who like the referees and like who sets the rules and who applies the rules. And I mean, one of his points was with regard to the financial collapse. It was all tied into the rating agencies, which nobody was supervising, and they are the ones who were, rubber stamping all of these, subprime mortgages, and and that's part of the reason, or one of the main reasons, why we got into the mess that we did. But above all else, Modern Love is far and away one of my favorite podcasts. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but
No.
it comes, the background to that is on, I think it's page 6 of the style section of the Sunday New York Times. There's a one-page essay. And I think I heard recently from Dan Jones, the editor, that they get something like 13,000 submissions a year. So that's, 1,000 a month. But they pick one a week and they publish it. Now, where the podcast came in is they would go to an actor or an actress and say, well, you've got kind of a good speaking voice. Would you please go and look at our archive, pick one of the stories, read it, which takes about 15 or 20 minutes. And when you've done that, then we will discuss it. But before we discuss it, we will go back and interview the author of that particular piece and get an update from, it could have been 6 months ago, 6 years ago, 10 years ago. And the byline for Modern Love is love, loss, and redemption. And it's not just boy meets girl. It can also be boy meets boy or girl meets girl, but it can be the fractured relationship between a father and a daughter, between siblings, the how I met my wife or how I met my husband, how I divorced my husband. So it's I consider it just superb writing, and so I would heartily recommend diving into it, and just fun and lovely writing. And here's my suggestions for long journeys, and some of these you may already be familiar with. The Probably one of the best known, and is something called Serial.
Yeah, listen to that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and have you listened to Shit Town?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And we also got in the car and had a long 3.5 hour journey there and back to Grand Isle here in Louisiana, and that was what we listened to. And in fact, as often happens with these, we get to our destination and there's still 10 or 15 minutes left in that episode. So
And you're sitting in the car.
We stay in the car with the engine running. Another one that's on the list that you see there is West Cork, and there's a lot of people in Ireland and some of us here who are very familiar with Sophie Toscan du Plantier, the French woman who got murdered. Yeah, 20 years ago, and they just did a podcast on that. That on my last journey from here to Houston and back, lasting 7 or 8 hours altogether, we listened to that. They did a lot of interviews with Ian Bailey, who is the
alleged murderer.
Yes, very likely the murderer. And actually, there's another one coming up on Doc on One, which is one of the Irish podcasts, but they've done one recently on the arms crisis in Ireland from that occurred in 69-70 with Charlie Haughey and Boland and Captain Kelly, and the gun running into Northern Ireland in the middle of the beginning of the Troubles. So, but anyway, before we head out on any journey, a couple of days in advance, we will, go through, what's recently come up. Is there something new on Serial? The So that's we always go prepared to have a really good experience, so that the journey just kind of whistles by. Um, the With regard to delivery apps, um, there's all sorts of different ones. We happen to use Pocket Casts, which Rubia picked out as a really good one, several years ago, and that's what we've used. It's free. I think there's a premium version, but we haven't needed to pay for that. And as I said, one of the main advantages with Pocket Casts, at least for us, is that you can filter it for the what are the podcasts that have dropped within the last 24 hours, and then very quickly zero in on the ones that you're interested in. So I could have 80 or 100 podcasts being downloaded on a regular basis, but I don't look at 80 or 100. I just look at the ones that have recently downloaded. I see what is the topic, and I guess in a way I'm becoming my own kind of radio or audio producer. I can decide what I want at at my uh, you know at, in my whatever that works for me. I use earphones a lot. Not in the car, but if I'm out biking, if I'm out doing, if I'm exercising in any way, I do a lot of gardening. And the ones that I have are the Trek Z, and they are bone conducting. So they kind of fit, actually they fit right in front behind me, but fit right here on my, just in front of my ears. And so that's particularly useful when I'm out biking around. I hear, uh, I'm not, my ears are not um, attenuated, if you like to say, so I can hear cars coming at me or backing out of driveways or whatever. But we often have a situation here at home where Rabia has her AirPods going, and I've got my Trek Z going, and we're kind of listening to our own. She's on Preet Bharara, and I'm on Modern Love or whatever. Um, and but like you were saying, when you get into your car, we'll switch over to the Bluetooth in the car, and even if we're just driving to local, Walmart or wherever, or Costco, a 15 or 20-minute drive, we'll pretty much always have a podcast on. So these are among my favorites overall, and I I really like the Writer's Almanac. It's a 5-minute thing that I first got introduced.
Was that Garrison Keillor used to do that?
He's still doing it.
Oh,
Still doing it, and it's just a uh, it's just something to kind of wake up to in the morning. And one that I've really enjoyed is Desert Island Discs.
British.
Yeah, it's been going for like 75 years.
Yeah.
And something that I've often done is I just pick one at random that I don't even know who the hell it is or what they do, and I'll just listen to it and say, oh, this could be somebody interesting. So, what did I listen to? I listened to an interview with Jack Charlton. Michael Lewis has also been interviewed on it. So it's and that's one that I will go to when I'm saying, you could even do that for a long journey. You could pick 3 or 4 Desert Island Discs and Uh, so, and you know, this is what works for me. It's uh, and like you were saying, uh, not listening or watching, not listening to much live radio. Um, Pretty much have avoided CNN and MSNBC and never Fox. Um, and in particular, superb for um, long journeys. And what I suggested to all the lads is that uh, you could take uh, a person, an author, or a topic that you're interested in, and just put the word podcast and then Google that, and then uh, something will pop up. After I gave this, I had an exchange with Basil, and and he was saying, "Oh my God, I didn't realize there was all this stuff." And I said, "Well, Basil, you're really into literature. I mean, this would be ideal for you, and you're home alone, so you can listen to it on your computer. You don't need to have earphones and stuff, or you can listen to it on your as you drive around." Um, and I said, in particular, you've been involved with the James Joyce Society, and you're very, very much into Ulysses and all of that. I said, there's surely a podcast. So after I think it was on the phone to him, I went and I looked, and just Googling James Joyce and podcast, I found half a dozen of them. And some of them were very interesting. So much so that I've kind of said, I'm going to subscribe to that, and I'm going to listen to that sometime soon. Um, and he had an interview with Edna O'Brien, Colm Tobin, all talking about Joyce. And I said, interesting. The so and so, oh yeah, the I also had a conversation with Michal O'Leary up in Boston, and
Yeah.
he was saying, well, he says, I watch a lot of the on YouTube, a lot of these TED talks, and I says, oh really? He says, would they be on podcasts? I says,
Absolutely.
I would guess yes. So I then went, Google podcast plus TED Talks, and sure enough, there's you can get a podcast of the 15 or 17 minutes of the individual um, podcasts of the individual TED Talks, but they also had deeper dives that lasted maybe an hour. So quite the variety. So
Well, let me tell you a couple that you didn't mention that I really like.
okay.
One is This American Life
Oh yes,
on NPR.
yes.
I always find that quirky and really, really interesting. And the big one that I listen to, at least once a week. I don't listen every night because the topics are heavy, is Ideas from CBC Radio. It's been going for about 50 years. It's 9 to 10 every night on CBC,
Uh-huh.
and they talk about something deep. And
Okay.
it can be a huge variety of things. And they have a podcast called Ideas.
Okay.
And you won't want to listen to every one of them, as you know, but
Right.
they tell you what the topic is. And oh my gosh, they're talking to so and so. I'll listen to this one. And they do a full hour in depth.
Right.
So it's kind of a long one. My erstwhile son-in-law is always trying to get me to listen to Hidden Brain. I don't know whether you know that one or not.
Oh, yes. Um,
I've
I
listened to it on and off.
um, I'm aware of it, and I'm trying to remember if I geez, I might even see if I have it on my uh on my list. Um, the Yeah, I could very well have it there somewhere. Uh, yeah.
I've just finished reading a remarkable Irish book. Um, that I hadn't heard of that a friend here in the village has recommended to me called Boy 11963. Have you read that?
No, say that again.
Let me get it properly. Here, it's the numbers, the sequence of the numbers that I hang on. Yeah, Boy 11963. It's about a boy, orphan, in the born in the 1930s and put into the Artane school.
Oh, geez. Oh,
at age 8. He was horribly looked after by foster parents
yeah.
who were getting money, and then at 8 he was put in the industrial school, and he had a lot of bad things happen to him. And he didn't know who his parents were. He never knew them, but he's tracked it all down, and it ends up being quite positive. But it gives you an amazing idea of Ireland from the 30s to about the 80s,
Yeah.
with the church in control and all the things that happened. It's actually a very good read, and it's not all Angela's ashes. It's not all depressing.
Yeah.
You know, but it's recently published in Ireland, and the guy's still alive, and he eventually finds out about his family, his mother, his father, the several families that they had, and he's been reunited in his old age with this huge family. It all works out pretty well, but he's from Stepaside Stepaside. What's the other place beside there? Yeah, County Dublin. But he ended up in Artane. But it's pretty horrible. Any case, about listening to podcasts, Christine and I have a different view. She's not a great podcast listener. She's a more visual person, but she doesn't like me sitting with earphones on all night. Why are we sitting in the same room when you've got earphones on? The second thing is she doesn't like me to go to another room and listen with earphones. So we do listen to the podcast in the car and stuff like that. But do you listen at normal speed, or do you listen at 1.5 or 2?
Well, I listen at normal speed,
Okay.
but by accident once when I was on my usual commute, I said, "God, this is going." They're speaking very, very fast, and somehow I had accidentally hit the button.
Yeah.
and this was. I eventually I had to pull the car over, and I had to pull up the Pocket Cast, and that's when I discovered that there was this thing where you can speed it up or slow it down. But no,
Yeah,
I
1.5 or 2. If it's a voice that I know well, and I'm not having any difficulty with the comprehension, I sometimes speed them up,
oh
and I'll go to 1.5.
okay.
And I don't find any discomfort at that level whatsoever.
Okay.
2 is a bit fast. I mean, if you listen to someone like Terry Gross or something, and just try it at 1.5 or 2,
Okay.
and you'll see if you like it.
All right.
The other thing that I do when Christine's not here, rather than wear earphones, I use a remote speaker and just Bluetooth to it.
Right. Yeah.
And listen to it. Unfortunately, my phone calls come in the middle of it, and all of that sort of stuff. But when I'm in the house on my own, I'm not super keen on having earphones all the time. So I've got a couple of remote speakers in the house that I can do that on.
Let me show you my speakers, and first thing you'll notice is this orange thing or red thing on it. I did a bad job of packing it away the last time I was away, and I broke this, but it's still operating. And I just put it on like that, and they fit just right here.
Oh yeah, so they don't go in your ear.
So it's not in the ear. It's so I can now. You can tell Christine that you know another couple where both of them wear earphones, and they find it it works okay, and it's not grounds for divorce, and then I will sometimes walk into a room where you maybe she's listening to something in a separate room, and then I'll just hang around and listen to what she's listening to. So, but we have lots of overlaps, but then lots of we're listening to different things. So
Yeah, we pretty similar tastes, but as I say, Christine likes a movie and I like audio. So more,
yeah,
I would say I'm more an audio person. And I find the new, you're talking about the podcast from the newspapers and so on, the New York Times and all the rest of it. I'm finding that increasingly they're doing videos, and
right.
you think you're going to read something and it pops up and it's a video, and I just forget it. I'm not going to sit here for 10 minutes and watch a video that I could read in 3 minutes. I'm just not going to do it.
Speaking of video, I mentioned Modern Love, the podcast. An offshoot of that has become I think it's a Netflix series or an Amazon Prime series, which has made a video version of a number of those episodes. And there's maybe 6 or 8 of them that they've done so far. And so, anyway, heartily recommend that. But I was going to ask you on the Boy 11963, is that on Audible or is it just a download right off your computer?
I bought it on Amazon. It's $9.99 on Amazon. It's a recent book, but I've read many of these types of books about my terrible childhood.
Yeah.
This one is actually quite good. It's a funny thing is, I'll tell you, I have to go pretty soon. Short story. I'm looking in the villages and there's a guy living not far from me, and you can put in where you came from on your, or the villages there's a telephone book and they'll put in the last town you lived in if you let them. In my case, it's Edmonton, Alberta. So I get some Canadians calling me, but I saw a guy from Ireland, and his name was Brian Lillis.
Oh, I think I know him.
I don't know whether you remember, there was a Brian Lillis, a classmate of ours in UCD, graduated in '69. He did civil, I believe.
Yeah.
So I called this guy to ask him if he was the Brian Lillis, because I looked him up, I Googled him first, I found he was the same age as me. And he's actually 3 weeks different. And I called him, and it turns out he's not. But he was at UCD with us, and he studied commerce, and he was from County Clare, and he worked for the Bank of Ireland most of his life as in the risk management department.
Yeah.
And he ended up working for NAMA or whatever it's called.
Yeah, the asset management.
Yeah, so he said, well, we got to meet. So I've been having coffee with him about once a month, and he recommended this book to me. So, I got the wrong Brian Lillis, but I got a guy who's the same age, who's from the same country, who went to the same university. The other Brian Lillis I found afterwards, I didn't talk to him, but he went to England and worked as like a town manager. He was a civil engineer, and he's somewhere in Lancashire. But
well, the next time you meet him, ask him if he knows a Peter Lillis.
Yeah. Well, no, he's an only child, I think.
So your phone is coming in, so you probably have to.
Oh, that's Christine will answer that one.
Anyway.
From Kilkee, and he went to boarding school in Roscrea, I think. Yeah. Then went to commerce at UCD. But he's actually an American citizen by birth.
Oh, okay.
His father was an American, and he became, they got him an American passport when he was 1 or 2 years old in, 1949 or something like that. Yeah. And as soon as he graduated from UCD, he came to the United States and he worked in banking in Chicago and in New York. And I think in '89, he went back and worked for the Bank of Ireland.
Oh,
Lived in
okay.
Monkstown, has a place in the Villages and Monkstown and one in Kilkee. But you could have crossed paths with him in his banking days. I think he worked for Continental. He said every bank he worked for went out of business. Continental Illinois was one of them. And he worked for one of the big New York ones that was merged into something else. And then he decided to go back to Ireland. And so I don't know how he ended up in the Villages. I have no idea. I never got a straight story on that.